This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Writer Life. I'm kind of sat here today, I've got my coffee ready and I'm all set up, and what I want to talk to all of you about today is, as you can see in the title, a dystopian future. I love dystopia, and it's been sort of a genre of books that I've read for pretty much most of my life. I love that kind of fascination with survivalism and, different kinds of worlds and different kinds of regimes. And I'm currently working on a new book in between all of the other books that I'm working on. And at the same time, I'm also preparing Abigail's Wedding for publication, which should be out towards the end of this month, which will be the fourth in the series of the Curio Chronicles. Now, this new book that I'm working on it's very much a new aspect of writing for me, because this is a complete work of fantasy. I mean, all my books are fictional, and kind of fantasy based, but the story that I'm actually creating is a brand new world, and there's new races in it. There's a completely different landscape and a really different cultural background. And like so many aspects of my writing, there's a good representation of good and evil, and also the oppressed. And I ponder at times to myself why I enjoy writing this kind of stuff. And then I realise, this is life today. All that I'm really doing is taking what I see and read, and then I place it in a completely different kind of world or situation. And I do love dystopian stories. I think I always have. All my life I've loved that rich, immersive quality of sitting back and wondering, how would I cope living the life of these people in the stories that I read? I've really enjoyed many aspects of the kind of fantasy dreams that I had as a child, trying to work out if I could escape the system as they did in Logan's Run. Or would I find a better system in 1984 that would deceive completely the Ministry of Truth? It's a great deal of fun. I mean, honestly, you really should try it. Or maybe it's just a bit of a writer thing, as we kind of do, like we create these situations and then we puzzle our way out so that we understand the whole process for writing in another book. I certainly have loads of pads of notes that are filled with little bits of information that, should I need them, they're there on hand to help my heroes find a way of escaping the systems they're in. There is a strange kind of fascination for me with survival. It does bring out different aspects of people, and especially when life is threatened, you've got to ask yourself, well, how does one react? I watched loads of stuff like this, dumping people naked in the middle of nowhere and leaving them to find a way of living through the next 3 weeks, as they do in Naked and Afraid, which, I've watched most of it. I think it's a fascinating TV series. I wrote a lot of this kind of stuff into Heirs to the Kingdom, and actually, most of the time I find myself going out into the garden and trying this stuff out, just to make sure that I actually wrote it correctly. And hey, they do say that writers should write about what they know about. So, to a degree, I'm off the hook. I mean, I can just pass it off as the neighbours look at me kind of strangely and say, no, it's book research. I look at the world today and I consider things such as, well, how will we survive an attack like we see in War of the Worlds? And will the population of today submit to the rules of something like a brave new world and a dystopian kind of society? Now, I think, looking at the world at the moment, I feel maybe the answer would be a definite yes. As I've said many times, I look to the past for guidance, into the real world, as I investigate the tactics of those who came before us, and then I learn from that, to make my own way forward in this life that I live today. I cannot deny that recently I've sort of been preoccupied with the Colosseum and how Rome used mass games and entertainment to suppress those who were becoming unruly. Back in Rome at that time, the people of Rome were hungry. There were shortages of bread, and the masses were becoming really unsettled. Caesar's answer was the games. He put on plays and gladiatorial fights, and those who came were given free bread to fill their stomachs and occupy their minds with sports and entertainment. And it really did work well. You have to consider that actually at that time, Rome was crumbling, the empire was actually falling, and yet its citizens were far too preoccupied to notice, as all of them were distracted by their form of entertainment. Now, if you take a step back and you do not allow your feelings and prejudice to occupy your mind, and you just observe, you'll find it's not really that unsimilar to today, where you can see the sorts of hysteria that are created by things like the World Cup, or the addiction of a TV series like Game of Thrones. There's reality TV, online gaming, and just to name but a few. It's a long list, and all of them distract the minds of the many, and it keeps them engaged and happy, while out there, in the wider world of the political and the elites, men of power make dark deals behind closed doors that will really greatly change the lives we know, in a way of living that into a way of living that, well, no one expects or can even contemplate. Now, I think about this kind of stuff a lot. After all, I'm always looking for a good storyline, and current affairs and life today really are the best melting pots to dip into for something to add to your latest chapter. Now, if you look at Heirs to the Kingdom, the virus I created was based on the 1918 flu pandemic, and yet as I actually published the very last book, which was book 8, I could see parallels of my writing done years before play out in real life with the virus of 2020. It was kind of, sort of scary and creepy at the time, as I realized how close to accurate I actually got things in book 5 of the series. So I suppose I cannot help it. I do have an inquiring mind, and so I pick up on things a lot of others do not seem that bothered about. Book reading is actually falling. Less and less people are buying books and reading books. Now, for years in the UK, local governments have closed libraries. And like me, if you're fascinated with dystopia, you have to wonder, is all of this a part of some elaborate plan? Has there been some quiet agenda that has decided it is better if the world is less informed and educated? A few years ago, I probably would have laughed at myself and reached for the tinfoil hat. But looking at the world today, these days, it does not appear to me to be quite as ridiculous a notion as it was back then. We know that reading is the fastest way to gain knowledge of other ways of life. It enlightens the reader to the dark realities of some forms of life, certainly in the case of Orwell, who to a degree has been pretty spot on with his prediction for the future. Looking at China today and their level of surveillance of their own people, he was pretty right. It's happened almost as if it has become the manual of the oppressor. When you read statistics that inform you that out of the billions of cameras that are recording on the streets of the world today globally, China actually makes up for half of them. And you suddenly understand how those novels you read were not really fiction. They were actually warnings of something that is actually becoming very, very real. Now, when I was a child, it was unheard of. Everyone had a right to privacy. And yet today, I can see how that privacy is constantly being invaded more and more. If you think about it, every city centre, every town, shop, car park, and motorway is filled with cameras. And all of them recording you secretly, watching your every move. Hell, they're even placing them on these automated robot till things that they use in the supermarkets. We all have to sort of use them now. We're being forced into it as they cut their staff numbers. I mean, after all, staff wages are the greatest cost of all businesses. And so therefore it harms the profit margins. Now we're told it's for our own safety. And honestly, whenever I hear that, I've started to think there's some ulterior motive, because suddenly I feel unsafe. I refuse to use the automated machines and tills. I actually stood in a queue a few weeks back, and I was approached by a staff member on the floor, and they told me that the machines were all free. It's kind of funny really, because I smiled at her and I simply told her I'm quite happy to wait and be served by a human, and I'm proud to be able to help this girl keep her job. I hate the bloody things. As I was told, it's for security, to prevent theft. That's why we have the cameras. I mean, think about it, what a bloody cheek. They fire the girl, and then they expect me to scan my own shit, and then they've got the nerve to check my receipts as I leave. If they don't trust me, if they have to film me, and they don't actually trust me to do their bloody job, they should give the girl her job back, which helps her feed her family by serving me, ensuring all is correct and above board. I find it really offensive that they do this. And again, they never asked us, they just took the tools away. It's yet more signs of how profit rules and people are just merely the pawns in their scheme of things, seen as nothing more than something to manipulate so that the rich and the powerful can get what they want at the expense of all of us. Now currently, governments and non-elected officials are making decisions about our lives that none of us have actually voted on. It appears now like we're no longer a part of the system. Decisions are made and we must oblige, and if we do not, well then we're all going to suffer. As I look back at the lockdowns of a few years ago, it's actually quite scary, as we were all forced to abide by a mandate. Now, this is yet another example of why everybody should start to read, because people are absolutely unaware that a mandate is not actually law, and yet heavy-handed police were sent in to enforce them. But there was no lawful reason for doing so. Now 3 years later, we see some of the truth is starting to leak out of the gaps, showing that there was a lot of collective manipulation from media and governments and large unelected bodies to control the narrative. And the people were, to a degree, completely conned and lied to. It is a true dystopian fantasy, one that actually any writer would happily write into a novel. But the cold, sobering light of today highlights the dangers of a powerful elite with a dangerous agenda for the people. Now the problem is, just like Rome, no one really cares. Their stomach is full with cheap junk food, and there's too much to entertain them, far too many distractions, and history is slowly being erased and changed to suit the narrative of power-interested parties whose agenda is hidden, but their goal is the same, and it is, when you look at it, dystopian in its origin. In 1984, Winston finally breaks and he betrays Julie, who he loved, and he asks them to torture her instead of him, and then he admits that 2 and 2 make 5. And currently, as we see a wealth of policies that are similar all over the world, I'm beginning to wonder, are the plots and the ideas in my stories starting to happen in real life as they did in 2020? Is there some form of global agreement to unite a single world that will oppress every nation into submission to live a life in an area of 15 minutes walking distance, similar to that of the Hunger Games? It certainly feels like it's actually coming. I look at Canada and currently, and I see a Mason Knox-like figure ruling elite, and his political party using the likes of law enforcement as their own personal cutter brigade to cut and slash away at the system to bring the people into ever decreasing circles of censorship and control. Canada now legally demands that platforms register their podcasts, and the government will deem what can and cannot be broadcast. Now, this is quite serious. Does that mean that people like me, writers, watchers of life, commenters on current affairs, in my podcast, will now be surveyed from now on to ensure I use all the right pronouns and walk to the party line? Censorship is the killer of freedom. And I've been watching more and more of it infiltrate into the masses, especially online. So much so that, at the moment, I'm considering replicating what I talk about here on another platform, because I'm aware that at times, yes, I do walk a fine line, and, I cannot openly talk about some of the things that I actually write about. Now, if my voice is deleted on here, there is another platform that I can post on, and I'm really considering having it as a backup, which kind of is insane really, because all I'm doing is talking about the books that I write. But actually, that is the problem. My latest story, which I'm about 20 chapters in, is about oppression, love, and the fight for survival. It holds the notions of freedom and living the life that you choose, which is sort of counter-narrative to the institutions of today. Everywhere we look, there are community guidelines, and if you stray out of them, your work just disappears. I wonder, will there actually be a time where the things that I love and write about become seen as so radical, I will actually see my books being removed from several large platforms? Now, this sounds ludicrous, but seriously, the way things are going, this is something that I really seriously have to consider. It's kind of a scary idea, and we're not there yet, but I cannot deny, as I watch the world, I do see a great divide opening, which is between those who are distracted and those who are awakening to a dawn of a new dystopian reality, and they are objecting to it. I've written stories that are based around the struggle of life and the fight of the oppressors. In Heirs to the Kingdom, when I started back in the late 1980s to really put the story together, which was a process that would take years before I finally had a manuscript, the world back then felt like a much safer and fairer place. I was writing post-apocalyptic dystopian stories. It was what interested me at the time, and I thought nothing about it. And yet, as I look around today, I realise that the characters I wrote and the struggles they had are indeed more suited to some of the things that I actually see happening in the world today. And that's actually quite scary. In Heirs to the Kingdom, Book 1, The Bowmen of Locksley, a messenger arrives at the gates of Locksley with a proclamation from Mason Knox as John and Robert Locks look down from the gates at him. And it goes something like this. They looked out across the road leading to the square in front of the gates. Row upon row of men with arms gathered in black shirts that bore the emblem of a bright red dragon. Each had a helmet of round steel and a shield of silver. A man in all black with a plume of yellow feathers on his hat rode a white horse slowly towards the gates. "Open the gates in the name of the Duke of Cornwall and newly elected Governor of England and its Isles." John turned to Robert. "Newly elected? I didn't vote for him." Now, back in 2007, when I added that to the final manuscript, it appeared amusing, even a little comical. The readers really enjoyed it. And yet today it feels far more sobering a reality of what I see in the world today. Now, take for instance the influence of an organisation of unelected officials who are working in partnership with many governments. Now, on this platform in particular, I'm hesitant to name them because, it's a key word that could take this episode down, because the world of business and politics have become embroiled in such a web with NGOs that one has to really tread lightly. Now, this organisation, quite openly talks about 15-minute cities, all-electric cars, brain implants to help control thoughts, and you will own nothing and be happy. And yet, they're starting to look and sound like Mason and his Cutter Brigade as they are dictating all of the changes in the world, and they boast of how they've now infiltrated every government. This is no longer democracy. It's the first step on a slippery slope into some form of totalitarian rule, as the unelected rich dictate the terms and living conditions of our lives. Now, this really is no different than Heirs to the Kingdom, Rise of the Raven, or the Countess of Darkness. Currently the British government has instigated net zero, which has long-term implications for all of us. But the thing is, we were never actually asked about it. They just did it, and then they told us this is how things would be. Now, I cannot deny, this does have echoes of 1984, and once again is brought to our government care of the rich elite, as they make this shit up in Switzerland once a year, having the best of everything, by the way, and actually breaking all of their own rules before they're even inflicted on us, the poor suffering masses. Now, the age and periods of my books may be different, but the message and rule of the mighty is still the same as those we're seeing today, where the super rich and powerful live their lives as they choose, and yet they dictate to the masses how all of us should live. And suddenly, we're starting to see that in the real world, 2 and 2 make 5. Or at least it does if you oppose many of the new gender identities, or these new medical procedures, or climate thinking, veganism, and a whole host of other narratives that we're all being force-fed to swallow by a media that's no longer free and is bought and paid for by the very same rich elites. These are things that people have written into their novels in the past. These are things I read as a child and I never thought would happen. Logan's Run and its euthanasia of the population. It's not unsimilar really to what they're suggesting in Canada with the elderly and the disabled. A Brave New World and the way it dictates relationships and outlaws monogamy. We're seeing something very similar in the way like the American society is trying to destroy the family unit. The Hunger Games, where we see areas pit against each other in a sort of distracting series of games to the death to amuse the masses and take their minds away from what is really happening in their dystopian world. I look at things like 1984 and the Ministry of Truth, and to be honest, it's becoming quite scary, because there's now certain words that have been struck from our language, and they've been replaced with what I consider to be kind of idiotic substitutes, such as people who menstruate. And there's this whole list of pronouns now to describe people, rather than what are their socially defined terms that have traditionally always been accepted. We're told certain things are misinformation, but then we find out a few years later, as we discover, they're actually the truth. And yet most of the world has not noticed this because there's a new football game or computer game or series on the latest streaming platform. And a huge chunk of the world is sat watching screens, oblivious to the reality of a world where camera usage and facial recognition are becoming the norm. The Colosseum is no longer an arena. It is actually our living rooms, where we're held captive by a screen that dictates the terms and conditions of our lives. And all of this is being owned and controlled by others of great wealth and power. And we will own nothing, but we will be happy. Because as we can clearly see, capitalism is now changing. Gone are the days when we would buy what we needed and companies had to kind of speculate and predict if they will get sales. We're now living with a system of rental where each month a set fee comes out of our bank accounts and we simply pay digitally. We own nothing and rent everything, and yet we stay sat before our screens watching blindly and obeying the narrative of do nothing and we will take care of everything for you. And the world moves on with the sheeple of society happy and content in their brick boxes, no longer understanding the beauty of the world outside. I mean, come on, my God, I should make this podcast into a book because it's the perfect ingredient for a dystopian fantasy. The problem with that is this is not a fantasy. This is actually happening today as you sit here listening to me ramble on about all of these things. And these are things that I've loved growing up, reading this kind of stuff. And suddenly I no longer need a library or even a newspaper. All of this is very, very real, and it's live streaming to my screen care of social media, which is carefully crafted to repeat the same messages over and over. It is no longer a book. It is actually life. And Huxley, Wells and Orwell were right. And the pressure to do something is overwhelming. But who would believe you? Who could you talk to and describe what you're seeing? It's the very same conundrum as Winston. Who can you trust to learn the truth or even talk about it with? I've asked the question a great deal of life. Is it actually safe now to speak your truth anymore? Can we really express our honest feelings and talk openly to others about it? Everyone has a mobile phone, and there is endless speculations about how safe they are. Pretty much everything online is digitally tracked and recorded, and our mobiles are no different. Is it a conspiracy theory that at times your phone can activate and listen to you? Well, we know one thing. We know that Alexa and all these other house things actually do that, and there's a whole host of other house devices. So, why not a phone? This is the stuff dystopian novels are filled with. But it's no longer really fiction. It's actually happening and is there right in front of all of us. I've reached the conclusion that talking about it, it's a dangerous game. So what do? Should we all remain silent and not test the water for fear of controversy? I'm quite sure that the rich and powerful would really love that. And I know they're trying to prevent it. So I'm watching it happen in real time. Certain platforms lean a certain way where you better be aware. Because if you talk honestly, you will be booted off the platform. You will be shut down. Outside in the real world, it's a place that people now fear due to the masses of violence and aggression that they see. Because if you do say something others do not agree with these days, when you use a wrong pronoun by accident, which is like the world's worst, you can forget it. Your rights and end forfeit, and you're going to be attacked, beaten and slandered. It's become a really frightening reality, and the net of control is tightening and tightening. Even the words that we use carry a warning to be on your guard. Do free societies exist anymore? Or are we caught in the grinder that is the matrix, tossing everything around in such a way that we no longer really understand how the rules are changing with each given second? Because, like what was fine to say last week, this week could get you cut off from your bank account or get you thrown out of a job. We have once again seen happen in Canada. Life is no longer the calm, relaxed, do your own thing and mind your own business sort of life that it used to be, because Big Brother is watching, and so you better be bloody well aware of that. It's funny really, because I can remember being 11 years old and sat in school talking in English classes about what the future would actually be like. I mean, it was amazing fun at the time. I've never forgotten that lesson. And we talked about, flying cars and eating protein pills and having robots do everything for us. Weirdly enough, we were a lot closer to the truth than I actually realized at that time. Looking back, the one thing we did not see coming was the stifling of free will, free speech, and civil liberty. We never thought there would be a society of rich and powerful people who make all of the decisions for us. And then we had really no choice but to accept the decisions that they made. That never even occurred to us 40 years ago. If you just consider the way things are at the moment, there is actually a war on meat. Okay, I'm safe. I've been a vegetarian for 44 years. But we've now moved into a situation where food is no longer real, and they want to get rid of food that is. It's not far really from sort of our imagined protein pills of my youth. Most of our food today is made from non-food substances, which are laced with chemicals, and one's got to really consider the revelations of the ending of the book Silent Green. I do ponder, is it possible that the rich would at some point do just that to make a profit and not inform the public at large? And the answer's got to be, looking at today, I would say without doubt, yes, actually they would. With farmland being seized by governments and people being controlled and pushed into smaller spaces, we're now creating a situation where food production will be reduced and farming livestock will become a thing of the past, according to all of the predictions of net zero. Fields of green will become industrial plants that pump fake meat and chemically produce so-called plant-based proteins that have all been laced with the ground-up high-protein contents of bugs that one particular German billionaire is very, very happy to advise us that we should start eating. I've got to ask the questions. What happened to choice? Did we miss some sort of memo? Isn't capitalism supposed to be all about supply and demand? Because it appears to me that these days it's not. We're now being told what to eat, told how to live, and very soon we'll have lists of our do's and don'ts, just like China. We'll have a surveillance system so far advanced and enhanced by AI that if we don't do as we're told, we will find our money is cut off by a bank that feels it has the moral power to deem what is fit and not fit for us to buy or to think. There's been rumours for quite a long while now. I actually know a couple of people whose banks were cancelled without any notice or reason. Literally, they went a bank and it was shut. But until it actually happened recently to Nigel Farage, a well-known personality, the population had absolutely no idea that this was happening. It really is alarming, because a time is coming where your carbon credit will determine what you can and cannot buy. And the bank will be watching you and watch what you're purchasing. And they will have an identical copy of your till receipt. And I actually find that a really, really scary proposition, because obviously I know from a lot of the things that I've read and studied that, if you can show what do people buy on a regular basis and all the things that they're into, you can psychologically profile them and find their weak spots. Is that really what this is all about? Is it a conspiracy, or am I actually quite close to the truth? You really, really don't know, and that's what makes this worrying. If I'd have written all of this into a book back in 2006, when I first began as a serious writer, I think today I'd be heralded as a man of great vision, just like, today Orwell is, as he sat in his cottage all those years ago on the Isles of Scotland writing his dystopian masterpiece. He saw this and he warned us. Even now, just sat here alone at my desk recording this, a Gen Xer blessed with the spirit of freedom, as all of my generation were. It sounds kind of hysterical and insane. And yes, this is a script for a perfect book. The kind of book I would have read as a child. But the really scary thing about all of this is that none of this is conspiracy. It's actually happening day in and day out, and it has been for years. How I wish I could travel back in time to, and meet the Eli and not have to fear what is happening, what have become the Morlocks of today. I mean, those books thrilled me in my youth. Reading The Time Machine by H.G. Wells was an epic adventure. I've read it millions of times since. How I would revel in that perfect and idyllic life of being at one with nature amongst a race of people who were calm and peaceful and filled with the natural wonder of the planet that we all live on. Rather than try to rape it for minerals and exploit the lives of others for profit, and all doing it whilst portraying an image of a perfectly moral and decent human being, like one very large tech giant does as he flies across the globe, burning hundreds of tons of fossil fuels whilst preaching how we should give up our cars and all go green. The global hypocrisy of the rich elite is not lost on me at all. I can see their game of domination and deceit. I've read many novels that show the likes of these people in their true form as they spout their lies and they pretend that they're saving the world, acting as if medically trained, giving out health advice and lecturing us all on how we should live. If this was a relationship and the poor of the world were his wife, he'd be labelled spousal abuser, but sadly that is not the case, as he flaunts his wealth and acts of alleged kindness in the very, very same way that Napoleon the pig did when he turned on those who followed him in Animal Farm and meets with the men after filling the silo with sand. The saddest reality of today is where money has now become more important than life itself. All that matters is the profits of those with the most money, and of course with that comes control. Countries are now measured for success on how well the rich are doing. In 2020, during a global pandemic, as people hid in fear in their homes and businesses crashed into oblivion and people sat hopeless as they lost their jobs, all that mattered was the amount of new millionaires that were created that year. No one actually asked the question, how can someone become a millionaire when the whole country is shut down? They just applauded those who got fatter and richer, peddling their products which we were told would save our lives. But ultimately they didn't, as the con was then revealed 2 years later. Money now means everything, and greed is good, even when there are endless cover-ups of sex scandals where children are used and abused. But nothing can be done because the authorities' hands are tied, because the real masters are the ones pulling all of the strings and taking the kickbacks from the child traffickers and those who identify as a new kind of sexual identity, which is suddenly accepted when years ago it was seen as sick and abhorrent. The silent masses sit in their houses being preached to by a paid-off media, hating their natural bodies, eating food that is killing them slowly, taking medical procedures that will render them disabled or dead, and no one cares as the wheel of industries turn and the movies and the games keep coming. Their bellies are full and their minds are distracted as the whole world walks slowly into the cage of digital and technological slavery. It is a dystopian wet dream, but it is no longer fiction. And I wonder as I sit why I even bother to write for a world that has, no longer got the focus or the will to read the words that I put on paper. I feel Winston is alive and well, and there are billions just like him. 2 and 2 still make 4 today, but we do have a brand new equation which has been set by the rich and powerful, as we see in modern day media, which they own, they finance and they manipulate. The equation clearly states the truth is a lie and the lie is the truth. I fear, as a writer who believes in freedom, I'm on the right side of history, but possibly on the wrong side of this new dystopian culture I find myself living in. Nobody knows what the future may hold, and I dream of that spark that ignites a full awakening from the masses before all is lost. And maybe that is why I write, because maybe one day some of my words may seep deep into the cracks of someone who will actually stand up, and shout at the top of their voices, 2 and 2 make 4. Who knows? I suppose we will see. I really love putting these together. Thank you everyone who sat here today and listened. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope that, in my own little tiny way, I can get a few people thinking and considering the world that is actually around them, and which I do with all of the stories that I write. I always throw something in there that will hopefully challenge the reader and make them think, because I do believe that that is actually the purpose of a really good book. It is to challenge the reader. It is to make them think about their own world and the world that's around them. If you've listened all the way through this, I really am very, very grateful, and I will be back next week. If you have enjoyed what you've heard today, then you know the routine by now. If you've not liked the video or you've not subscribed, please just hit the subscribe button, like the video, because it does help me get my voice out there and a little bit louder so that others can hear it and others can join us. I'll be back next week with something else completely different to hopefully, broaden your mind. And in between all that, keep reading the books. Information is power. And hopefully, books will hang around for long enough for us all to learn a lot more. Until next week, I will see you and say goodbye.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.